And that was the classic movie scene from the 1999, yes, 1999 movie, The Matrix. And if you feel like you've never seen that clip before, you're at least 20 years out of date. That is The Matrix, and the classic scene in which Neo, the main character, discovers that the world is not all that he thought it was. And the makers of The Matrix make no secret of the fact that they borrowed from the Christian story in the making of that movie. And so the world is not all that it seems. Neo is the savior character who comes alongside to lead a resistance movement and put the world to rights. And the other character in the scene, Morpheus, is the John the Baptist character who announces the way that's coming. Morpheus can't save the world, but Neo can, and Morpheus sets the way. So kind of exciting. And so that's why I want to welcome you to Red Pill Sunday. Red Pill Sunday. We're here to start that this morning, but before you get worried, don't worry. I'm not going to tell you that there's a red pill on your seat or under your seat. No ushers will be distributing red pills either now or later. We won't be asking anyone to take any red pills. However, we are going to go a little bit further this morning by asking this. Have you ever thought about the world and thought it isn't quite the way that I thought it was? Have you ever asked yourself the question, I wonder what it's all about? Where's my life going? What's this whole world all about? Have you ever wondered if there's something more going on than meets the eye? That's another phrase that we like to use. There's something more going on than meets the eye. Or maybe you like this phrase that the truth is out there. And you've wondered that there's something more going on in the world and you look for something deeper. Or maybe you're not that kind of person and you've just decided there is nothing deeper, there is nothing more. I have none of those kinds of concerns. I just see the world for the way it is. I just accept it the way it is. I just deal with it and I live my life. I don't have those kind of existential questions about who I am, where I'm going, or whether the world or even my life has any purpose. And I kind of live my life in just a state of acceptance. In either case, whether you think there's something more or wonder if there's something more, or you live in a state of acceptance, like the early followers of Jesus this morning, we're going to discover that there is something more going on than meets the eye, more than we ever realized. And we're going to ask ourselves the question, how do we respond when the lights go on and we discover that? So if you don't like Red Pill Sunday, and I know some of you might be a little bit uncomfortable, you're saying, what in the world? You invited me to a place where they're talking about taking red pills? I have a different title. You can choose your own title. So we can say it's One Loaf Sunday. One Loaf Sunday. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Bread, or are we really going to be talking about bread? Well, we're going to get into that too. Are you ready for this? Okay, I'm just checking if you're awake. Just checking if you're awake. So we are in a summer-long series going through the book of Mark. And Mark is one of those, as they call it, narrative accounts or storytelling accounts in which Jesus' life, his miracles, his teachings were chronicled for us. And we're going to be going through that all summer. And today we arrive at Mark chapter 8. And I just want to set up Mark chapter 8 for you. I'm really appreciating, by the way, that our teaching pastor, Mark Gagnon, gave me Mark chapter 8 to talk about because it's such an important chapter. It really is the hinge of the book of Mark. Up until this time, the disciples and Jesus have been hanging around the area around the Sea of Galilee. They've been learning who Jesus is. They've been responding to his call on their lives. They've been watching him do all kinds of miraculous things. After this point, the story begins to change, and it changes right here in Mark chapter 8, where the journey will no longer be around the lake and the teachings of Jesus. It will be the march towards Jerusalem and what will happen at the end of the book of Mark around the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. And up to this point, so far, I went back and I looked at this just to make sure I understood. There are 16 recorded miraculous incidents prior here to Mark chapter 8. Miracles that establish who Jesus is and that he's more than just a good moral teacher. So I think it bears just reviewing a little bit about what kinds of miracles have taken place up to this point. 4 different times in the chapters leading up to this, Jesus has encountered the demonic realm, or the realm of evil spirits, and he's cast an evil spirit out of somebody. In other occasions, he has authority and heals someone of what you might call an ordinary sickness, like a fever. He's healed people of skin diseases. He's healed people of nervous system disorders. He's healed people of birth abnormalities. Natural forces like wind and waves are not too much for Jesus. He calms the wind and the waves. He's provided food miraculously for large crowds of people. On one occasion, more than 5,000 people. On another occasion, more than 4,000 people. He's also healed cognitive concerns like hearing and sight. And in one incident, he raises someone from the dead, showing that he also has authority over even life itself. If you were here last week, when our youth pastor Daniel Bell was speaking, he talked about in the previous chapter how Jesus even has authority over the written words of Scripture when he talked about food being now clean that was previously considered unclean. And in this chapter, Mark chapter 8, there's even what I call a 2-stage healing. And that is not something we're going to talk a lot about, but yeah, that actually happened where Jesus put his hands on a person that was blind, and he says, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see people walking around, but they look like trees." Jesus puts his hands on the same blind person again, and he says, "What do you see now?" And he sees perfectly well, and he's completely healed. And I just think that in the 16 recorded incidents, Jesus is showing I'm even more creative than you realize when I do it in a 2-stage like that. So as I say, after this point, there are only 4 recorded miracles that take place in the latter part of the book before the events of the resurrection. So we can summarize where we've gotten in Mark in this way. Jesus has authority over all things. Jesus has authority over all things. So now let's get into Mark chapter 8. And this summer I've been listening to podcasts. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with podcasts. Sometimes I get into them for a while, then I find them too tedious, and plus I get behind, and I don't like getting behind, and so I abandon them for a while. But I've gotten back into some great podcasts this summer, and they're often organized by chapters or parts. So let's organize our message this morning in 3 parts, like this. Part number 1, signs. Part number 1, signs. And let's start off with Mark chapter 8 and verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. A sign from heaven. Now, I just finished telling you that there have been 16 recorded signs so far, but for the Pharisees, they're asking for something deeper, something even more. Oh, maybe like a parting the Red Sea kind of a sign. Or, oh, maybe like, how about fire coming down from heaven? That would be a good one. Something that would even impress us religious experts that you really are who you say you are. And that's what the Pharisees ask for. And just as an aside, as we get going, I'm going to ask you to reflect at different times this morning and put yourself into this story. Have you ever been that kind of person who says, oh, well, if there's a sign from heaven, then I'll really be sure that what you guys are talking about is true. And so you take a circumstance in your life and say, Jesus, I need a sign. Not just an ordinary sign, but if you do this outstanding thing for me, then I'll really know, I'll really believe, and I'll really get my life on track. It's kind of like the Pharisees saying, I see your miracle, but I raise you one sign. So let's go on and see how Jesus responds to this kind of a demand. Mark chapter 8, verse 12. No sign will be given. No sign for you. That's how Jesus responds. He says he's having none of it. He sighs deeply. I've already given you 16 signs that I am who I am, and still you don't believe. And it's the Pharisees saying, we need something outstanding to cause us to believe. And Jesus will have none of it. No sign will be given because he doesn't operate in this way. And it makes me wonder, because sometimes I've been a sign asker too. Sometimes I've said, God, I need a sign. Will you do this thing for me? Will you show me by some kind of a closed door and an open door? And there's nothing wrong with looking at closed doors and open doors as part of the discernment process of what God is really saying. But sometimes I've been a sign asker and I don't see a sign and I wonder what's going on with that. And I wonder here as I read this passage in Mark chapter 8, if Jesus is really inviting me in to say, hey, friend, there's something much bigger than signs going on. And it makes me realize that the conclusion of part number 1 of our message is this, that it's not a miracle convention. It's not a miracle convention. And Jesus was saying in Mark chapter 8, miracles aren't hard for me. I think you can see that I've done plenty of them. In fact, just in case you wondered, I gave you one creative one. I healed a guy in 2 stages, as we just saw a little while ago. But if you wonder why you're not seeing a sign, why you're not seeing proof, why you're not seeing your miracle that you want to see, perhaps it's because Jesus is inviting you into something deeper. And he's saying there is more. There's another reality behind this. And I'm not the anti-supernatural person that I want to be cast in that box to say, oh, that guy that spoke today, he doesn't even believe that miracles happen anymore. No, I'm not in that box. Jesus can do a miracle anytime that he wants, and we see it among our friends, we see it in our own lives, and we just say, that was from God. But I think what we're finding here is Jesus saying, I invite you to something deeper. And so in response to the Pharisees, here's what happens. He left. He got back into the boat and went to the other side. Let's move on to chapter 2, or part number 2. Part number 2, yeast. And maybe this is where we get to One Loaf Sunday. Yeast. Chapter 8 and verse 14 says the following, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. This is interesting. If you've been following along our series in the book of Mark this summer, we've been encouraging you to read ahead and read the chapter and think about the scripture verses before you come on Sunday. And maybe you did that this week, and maybe you thought about this particular verse. The disciples had brought one loaf. I find that curious. 12 disciples plus Jesus, 13 men, one loaf. That's going to be rather a light snack. And so I ask myself, why didn't they bring leftovers? What's wrong with leftovers? Just earlier in this chapter, 4,000 people had been fed bread. And the story tells us earlier in Mark chapter 8 that the disciples went around and picked up 7 baskets of leftover pieces. So as Jesus dismisses the Pharisees and heads out in the boat with the disciples, why didn't the disciples go, hey, grab one of those baskets? We'll just bring the leftovers with us. We'll have plenty of food for the journey. I wonder about the leftovers. And I wonder if this was actually the disciples saying then to themselves, leave the leftovers for the crowd. We'll just bring this one loaf along because maybe Jesus will do his own personal miracle for us. Oh, I know he just finished talking to the Pharisees and saying, no miracles, I've already given you signs. But, that was the Pharisees, and Jesus was kind of against them, their hypocritical behavior. And so maybe we'll have our own miracle on the boat here this morning. So just bring one loaf along. Ever thought that? Ever thought, I know, Jesus, you didn't do a miracle for those people over there, but I'm a really dedicated follower. I'm one of your close-in people, and you can do a miracle for me. Or maybe you don't think of yourself as close in to Jesus, but you're like, but Jesus, my situation is so desperate, much more desperate than those other people. And so I wonder if you'll do a personal sign for me. And I believe that Mark includes this in this chapter so that we realize there's a deeper lesson coming. To go back to the Matrix illustration, the red pill moment is coming, and more is going on here than we realize. Let's go on and see what Jesus says to the disciples about the one loaf. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. The yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. I'm just going to unpack this for us here a little bit this morning. Mark's account is interesting. The other gospel writers tend to talk about the yeast of the Pharisees. Mark also includes this piece about Herod. So we'll get back into it right now, but let's start with the Pharisees. We have to go back a chapter to see where we were last week in Mark chapter 7. And this is what happened in Mark chapter 7. You might remember it. Jesus said to the Pharisees, you've let go of the commands of God and you're holding on to human traditions. And this was over the matter of how to wash hands properly before eating. You might remember that illustration of only wash your hands in this way, and what Daniel was saying about that last week if you were here. But what we learned from Jesus in Mark chapter 7 was this is hypocrisy. Jesus called the whole episode hypocrisy, and he called the Pharisees themselves hypocritical, that you put all of these rules on people. You placed rules over relationship. You place product over people. You place appearance over application, and you place the outward over the inward. And Jesus writes across all of that, hypocrisy. And that was the yeast of the Pharisees. Commentators talk about the yeast of the Pharisees being the teaching of the Pharisees, and this was it, that it's about rules, it's about traditions, it's about how we tell you that you have to practice the faith in order to be considered worthy. It's so nice to sit here in our modern day and say, oh, those dumb Pharisees, they were so bad. I would never be like that. You know, we like to think of ourselves as being better. But friends, it is so hard to break this in the church today, this kind of hypocrisy, this kind of rules and traditions over relationship. It's hard to break that. Ask yourself if you've ever been this person who contemplates a decision and then says to yourself, I wonder what the church people would think. I wonder what the church people would think if I do that, if I wear this, if I buy that, if I go here, if I take that. I wonder what the church people would think. And we live our lives based on the expectations or the perceived expectations of others about our Christian behavior because we want to be perceived as being those kinds of people that really have it together. And over all of that, Jesus says, that's yeast. That's the yeast of the Pharisees. Well, what about the yeast of Herod? Let's take a look 2 chapters back, what took place in Mark chapter 6. This was an occasion where there was a telling of the story of Herod's relationship with John the Baptist. And in Mark chapter 6, it says, Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. I find that interesting. I did a lot of reading this week on the yeast of Herod, and what I discovered is there are numerous opinions about what that means, the yeast of Herod. So I love when there's numerous opinions shared because then I can just share my opinion. What I want to tell you this morning and share with you this morning as I thought about this is the yeast of Herod is some kind of spiritual curiosity. And when I say spiritual curiosity, I'm not talking about the thing that we talk about here at Lakeside all the time, that it's good to come with your questions, it's good to come with your search, it's good to come and discover Jesus here at Lakeside. I'm not talking about that. But what I am talking about is that Herod liked to listen to John the Baptist. And I just wonder, is there a type of curiosity that's just like, I just want to find out a little bit about this religious stuff. I just want to add some faith into my life. I just want to check this out a little bit so I can be conversant in this, or perhaps so that maybe my life will even improve. Who knows? You never know. Maybe my life will get better with a little bit of Jesus in my life. And I think what Jesus is helping us to understand is that is shallow understanding. That is not going far enough, and I'm about to show you that it goes much further than that. I love how the disciples respond to this whole matter of the yeast of the Pharisees. They respond by saying, it's because we only brought one loaf. Jesus is really upset with us for bringing one loaf, and Jesus lets them know, I'm not upset about the one loaf that you brought. The disciples are so concerned about all of this matter of bread. The disciples seem to have all the answers. Oh, it's because we didn't bring bread. Don't you just get bothered and a little bit annoyed by all those religious people who seem to have all the answers? Who seem to say, oh, it's all about this. Oh, this is the way it is. Oh, the Bible, yes, I studied and I know what it all means. I think Jesus has a word of criticism or critique for that too. And he says, I want to invite you further. I want to invite you deeper. And I think that sense of spiritual certainty, when we seem to have all the answers, I think that's done more to drive people away from the Christian faith than anything else. It's like, oh, just come to us. We've got all the answers. No sense of mystery, no sense of wrestling over the deep and hard questions of life. Just come to the church. We've got all the answers. I want to let you know that as Lakeside's executive pastor, I'm committing to you. I was committed to this before, but I'm kind of declaring it now. I'm committing to you that I will lead the church with a deeper sense of calling, a sense of going further, a willingness to wrestle with the difficult questions, with a complete fear of the future, a willingness to examine everything we do and believe and ask why, and ask whether that is all that God is saying about that particular subject or matter. We won't shrink back from the hard questions. Why won't we shrink back from the hard questions? Is it because we're a church and I'm a leader who just wants to be controversial and I don't want to be known as someone who's controversial? No, it's not because we want to be controversial. It's because we want to be contagious. We want to be a church where people come here and they truly can discover Jesus, and they can discover a place that doesn't have all the answers worked out. Will discover that we are a place where you can dive into the mystery of the Christian life and you can discover that there is so much more going on. And friends, this is our moment, this is our generation to stand in the gap and be people like that. And that's what we want to be about. Can you see how unattractive it is to be a faith that just doesn't go anywhere beyond tradition and low-level spiritual curiosity? I can. And so let's summarize part number 2. For the Pharisees, it was about hypocrisy. It was about placing traditions over truth, placing traditions above what God himself says. And for Herod, it was this sense of low-level spiritual curiosity. Oh, I just like to listen to John. I just like to listen to stuff. And so sometimes it's just better to keep your mouth shut. Sometimes it's just better to keep your mouth shut. I think the disciples would have been well warned with that word, but that's kind of rude language. So let's go on to the next slide. Sometimes we need to seek deeper understanding. Yeah, so we'll just leave that there. Sometimes it's better to seek deeper understanding. And all of us at one level or another, we'd probably say we're all seekers of understanding, aren't we? I mean, I know I am. I'm a person who wants to understand more. But some of us have come to a kind of a shallow understanding of what the Christian faith is all about. Maybe we've come to that understanding that the Christian faith, it's a miracle convention. When you need a miracle, you get a miracle, and we talk that that's the way it is. And I think Jesus is saying to us, that's shallow. There's something more than that. Some of us have come to believe this kind of what we call moralistic therapeutic deism. That's a phrase we've used here a few times. It's kind of fancy words, but we've kind of said that the faith is about moralistic behavior, like God will help me to be a better person. Or we've said it's therapeutic. When I'm sad, I can come to Jesus and he will make me happy. Or it's deistic in that sense of, oh, God isn't involved in the affairs of your life. He's just kind of out there like an impersonal force. And Jesus says, that's shallow. For some of you, maybe the reason why you're just in the investigative phase of the faith is you've wondered, is Christianity a type of faith that reinforces patriarchy? That it's sort of a men here and women here kind of a faith? And maybe you've come to that understanding, or you've wondered if that's really what Christians believe. That is shallow. That is not going far enough to understand what God really has to say about that and other things. You've come to understand maybe that Christians in their history have forced conversion upon other people at the tip of a sword. And you've said, I'm not for it because of that. And that too is shallow. Maybe you've wondered, does Christianity actually encourage withdrawal from the modern world and the concerns and interests and affairs of the modern world, or that the faith can't accommodate contemporary moral and ethical dilemmas? And that, friends, is weak thinking. Jesus invites us to go much further than that, and he's going to help us to do that in part 3 of our message. So let's get on with that. Part 3 is truth. And for part 3, we're going to skip ahead a little bit in Mark chapter 8 here, and we're going to focus in on just this one verse 34 in Mark chapter 8. And he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." Years ago, I had a book. It was called True Discipleship by William MacDonald. And it was a little tiny, about 80-page paperback book that had flames on the front. And I love books that have flames on the front. Don't know why I ever got rid of that book. But years ago, when we were moving, about 5 years ago, Andrea and I looked at all our books, and we both agreed that we had too many books. And that's as far as Andrea went. I agree we have too many books. I went so far as to throw most of them out, including this one. But anyway, I had this book called True Discipleship. And this is really where I want to go here, because I think Jesus now says what the further and deeper thing is. And it's 3 things: to deny, to take up your cross, and follow me. So let's just unpack those together this morning. To deny yourself is to disown, really, to renounce your sense of self, to acknowledge that the Christian life, this life you're living now of following Jesus, isn't really an improved life, it's an exchanged life. You've done as the Apostle Paul has said, "I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." And to deny yourself is to acknowledge that Jesus is at the center of my life. I've laid down my life, so to speak, not in a physical way, because you're still here, you're still alive, but I've given up ownership. I've renounced ownership of my life, and I've given that to Jesus. If you're not a Christian and you're not exploring what does this mean, it's that sense that it's not just about improving your life through adopting a set of beliefs and practices, though it will do that, but it's to understand that it's an entirely new, entirely different life that has begun, a rebirth of sorts. And I ask you the question this morning, what would that mean for you to deny yourself? To understand that it's about a wholly new and totally different kind of life. And I'm not going to give you the answers because I don't know what that's going to mean for you to deny yourself. And the second phrase he says is to take up your cross. To take up your cross. And for sure, this doesn't mean put a piece of jewelry around your neck of a cross as a sort of memorial to Jesus. Or it doesn't mean some kind of I deal with my cross. I carry my cross. I have this hard relationship with my brother. I have this difficult physical ailment, and that's my cross to bear. I think, again, it goes much further than that. In the first century, you do know this, I think. The cross was an instrument of cruelty and pain and dehumanization and shame reserved for criminals and the lowest social classes. It was used to quash rebellions. And so ask yourself, what would it mean to take up my cross? What would it mean for me to identify with the one who hung on a cross for me? How would that apply in my life today? And you can hear the echo of Jesus calling you further and calling you deeper, much beyond what the disciples thought when they said, "Oh, I think we forgot to bring enough bread." And thirdly, he says it means to follow me, to get moving, to stop listening to other voices, including listening to my own voice, to single-mindedly put yourself in step with Jesus and what he is saying, what he's doing, where he's going. That's what he was saying to his followers, and that's what he says today. To deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Now, as we conclude this morning, I want to invite the band to come up. We're going to sing that song, "Build My Life," one more time in just a couple of minutes. But at Lakeside Church, we believe that everyone can move forward. This is one of our core values here. There are 5 of them, and they all sound kind of the same, that at Lakeside Church, everyone can. And this is one of them. Everyone can move forward. I love that it's not Everyone can move sideways, backwards, or stand still. Everyone can move forward. And the church is here to walk alongside of you, to move forward in your life, to move forward in your understanding of the kind of life that has been made available for us. This morning at the end of our service, we'll have people from our prayer team that'll be up here up front. And if you want to come forward, that is normal. That is good. Come and be prayed for about denying yourself, taking up your cross and following him. Go ahead and do that. Come forward this morning, but well beyond this morning. Look for someone in our church that you think is a person that's been walking this life for a lot longer than you. And just say, can you mentor me? Can you give me input in my life and help me move forward? We have a staff team here that is able to help you. We have an elders team that's able to help you. And keep moving forward. I think that's the lesson of Mark chapter 8. Recently, around the church, there's been discussion about, hey, what's coming next at Lakeside? Where are we going? What are we going to be doing as a church? And you know, friends, there's lots of things that need attention here around Lakeside. And yeah, we can improve this, we can rebuild that. And you know, we could all probably write down a list if we passed a piece of paper around and list things that need to be improved. We need to make our programs better. We need to make our building and facility better. We need to make our staff better. Like you could put it all down, all that kind of stuff. But really, there's been a ton of energy in recent days to say, yeah, but what about the world beyond ourselves? What about the world that's beyond Lakeside Church? What are we doing to reach out and engage with our community around us? And there is a ton of discussion going on around this, even at this time. And I want to signal to you that that is what we're thinking. We are looking beyond ourselves. It's not that we don't want to improve what we already do, but we want to go much beyond just improving what we do and, have better this and better that. Our vision is truly to do something that just goes beyond ourselves and isn't about ourselves. Jesus is inviting us to go beyond signs, to go beyond bread, beyond simplistic spiritual sounding platitudes, to a wholly new and different kind of life. And isn't there something that just rises up within you and says, I want that. I want that in my life. I don't want to just build my life around here to be about myself and making it a few degrees better, but I want to rise up into this newer, deeper, further kind of life that Jesus offers. That's what we're about here. And that's the lesson of Mark chapter 8. And so this morning as we conclude, let's sing Build My Life Again. Maybe Rachel, you're just going to lead us into that. And thank you for doing that. So this morning, I said the alternative title was One Loaf Sunday. And on One Loaf Sunday, my question for you is, are you going to make it about this one life? Or are you going to respond to the invitation of Jesus to say, I want you to move forward. I want you to go deeper and further with me. And my encouragement is just receive Jesus' invitation and go further with him. We're going to discover as we go through the rest of the book of Mark that Jesus is going to take us much further than this. So this morning I remind you that there'll be people here to pray with. This morning there'll be others to talk to out in the atrium. And don't forget about our barbecue that's this morning. Maybe you'll get some of this out there. And next week, our teaching pastor, Mark Gagnon, will be back as we get into Mark chapter 9 together. Looking forward to that. Bless you this week as you go.